graduate student representatives will interview our guest speakers regarding their experiences in leadership positions in hopes of mentoring the next generation of health scientists. We're really excited to have our first guest speaker today. We'd like to welcome you, Dr. Deonandan. Today's session will be moderated by us, Julia Hajar and Michelle Yang. We'll take turns throughout the hour to ask Dr. Deonandan about his journey to his current leadership position. We will try to leave a few minutes at the end to allow for questions from our participants. But please feel free to type in your questions in the chat box and we'll try to get to those. Also, please kindly mute your microphones during the presentation to avoid background noise. So I'll pass it over to Michelle now to introduce Dr. Deonandan.
Okay, we're so glad you could all join us today. Dr. Deonandan is a global health epidemiologist, associate professor at the Faculty of Health Sciences, the assistant director of graduate studies and research at the Interdisciplinary School of Health Sciences, and the executive editor and founder of the Interdisciplinary Journal of Health Sciences. In addition, Dr. Deonandan is an award-winning author, journalist, science communicator, and has become one of the leading Canadian experts frequently sought after by the media to discuss COVID-19. Welcome, Dr. Deonandan, and I'll pass it over to Julia to begin our series of questions.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. So welcome, Dr. Deonandan. I'm also lucky to have Dr. Deonandan as one of my co-supervisors, and it's really great working with him. So I wanted to start a little bit with the background and biography. So a lot of people are interested in kind of how you started and how you came to be such a leader. So I'll start with this question. What did your trajectory into academia look like? Could you please tell us a little about your education and your career path?
You know, it's funny. Some of these questions were sent to me in advance, and I deliberately not prepared because I want this to be as spontaneous and organic as possible. So I have no idea what I'm about to say. I will say, though, that when I was invited to be part of this, my first response was, leader? I'm a leader? The only thing I've ever led was like a bunch of guys to their death in Call of Duty. So, but it caused me to think about, you know, what is leadership? And I suppose we're all leaders in some capacity. So the extent to which I qualify, I'm happy to comment. My educational path has been odd. I was always, well, let's back up for a second. I'm an immigrant from Guyana, a poor rice farming country in South America. Our parents and I came to this country in the early 70s, late 60s, the USA first, and we were very, very poor. There weren't a lot of educational role models in my family, but education was something we all aspire to. It was seen as the path out of poverty. And I know that many students listening to this understand that outlook. Education is the great leveler. The problem is that education is also an expression of a passion. And if you have a passion for something, you tend to want to follow that in your scholastic endeavors. And often that does not lead to a path of economic wherewithal. So my issue was I loved literature and I wanted to be a writer. And there's no such thing as a rich writer, with the exception of a handful of individuals who we all know about. But the vast majority are still waiting tables, but they're happy being writers. The other thing, too, is that I was good at science and I read a lot of science books. So when it came to pursue my formal academic training, I struggled to choose which path to take, to study literature or to study physics. But the choice was taken from me because I know my family would not tolerate me being a scholar of English literature. That's the price of being from a conservative immigrant background. So I studied physics, and I maintained my writing on the side. And this is important to the story that I'm going to tell because, as I tell every student, learning to communicate at a high level is your passport to great things. That communication can be orally, it can be via emotive circumstances. It can be most commonly via writing, and writing for a variety of contexts, not just literature as I was writing for. So I studied physics, and I was good at physics in high school. I was the best physics student in my high school, which is a big high school in Toronto. When I got to university, I was not the best physics student. So I lost my scholarship in the first 2 years. I got a bunch of D's. And that was a sobering moment. You realize the thing that you hang your identity on, your academic achievement, is not going to take you through the rest of your life. You need other things to define your identity. And for me, it was, okay, I'm not the smartest guy in the room anymore. I'm now the D student in physics. That's an important moment I'll come back to later on, I hope. But I also did a major in physiology and a minor in anthropology and enough classes in political science to get a minor in that too. My perspective was cram as much education as I can into that undergrad degree because who knows when that opportunity will be there again. And then when I went to grad school, this was back in the day when professors would compete for grad students. There was a time. There were so few grad students that were on demand. And being a physicist with a biology background, I was ideal for neuroscience. So the neuroscience profs came calling with great packages and offers, and I took the first one offered to me because I didn't know any better. And my research was on bouncing lasers off my eyes using saccadic research. And the idea was you measure the time it takes before foveating a target and beginning movement towards that target. That's a latency period. And you can use that to detect brain cancers, possibly. So to do this, though, I had to bounce lasers off my eyes in pitch black darkness. And when I wasn't in darkness, I was wearing red goggles to maintain my dark adaptation. Imagine doing this every day for weeks on end. It's depressing being in the dark all the time. So I was depressed. And then my girlfriend dumped me because I'm an asshole. So a combination of being depressed and suddenly being tragically single, the depression was crippling. And I remember the moment of clarity in the lab one day when I realized I have to take control of my life. And this is an expression of leadership, I think, is understanding the self, taking control of yourself and your life, and directing it according to your values and desires. And I did a moment of truthful clarity that I think everyone should appreciate. And that is, I asked myself, what do I care about? What do I love? I cared about not working with my hands again. I cared about never being unemployed. I cared about travel. I cared about changing topics intellectually every month or so. I cared about not going backwards. My ego couldn't handle going back and doing another master's degree. I had to go forward, a PhD or something else. And I wanted to be sexy. Okay, this is an important one because this is where the honesty kicks in. If I was having this conversation with somebody else, I say, well, I care about saving the world and shit like that, which is true. But when you're truthful to yourself, you understand I cared about when I go to a party and someone asks what I do, I want them to be impressed. So honesty must be the core of your decision making. And again, leadership springs from honesty and self-discovery. And from that, I discovered epidemiology that checked off all those boxes. So that is the path that took me into epidemiology. And once I was in epidemiology, I was terrified of being unemployed one day. So I made sure I buttressed my education with other skills that would take me down the leadership path as defined loosely in this conversation. And that included starting my own businesses. I started 2 businesses when I was in graduate school. I got accounting training. I took as many additional seminars as I could. I was attending these breakfast meetings of the Toronto Biotechnology Initiative, which is all these drug company CEOs. And I was terrified. I'd go to the back room, pay my $20 to have scrambled eggs and listen to these presentations until eventually I found the courage to talk to a bunch of CEOs. And quickly this became job opportunities. So when I was a PhD student, I was hired to be a grant writer for these biotech incubators. I wrote the business plan for the Mars Institute in Toronto, for example. And this has paid dividends decades later. These connections that I've made, the skills that I developed. So the long and short of it is I made choices out of fear, but choices driven by a desire for self-knowledge, and choices that eventually gave me the buttressed skill set to achieve leadership in a variety of contexts. Long answer, easy question.
Amazing. That's so interesting. I always love these kind of questions in our leadership sessions because you learn so much about the professors or whoever we're interviewing. And everyone has kind of a windy road to get where they ended up, which I always find interesting. So the second question I have is, you kind of touched on this already, but during the pandemic, you've really emerged as one of the country's key experts when it comes to discussing COVID. And you kind of explained your path to leadership a little bit. But was there a specific point where you really decided to make a career shift into epidemiology? Like, what was that turning point for you?
Yeah, as I mentioned, it was based entirely on the values of what I wanted in my career, not about the science of epidemiology. And when I decided to pursue epidemiology, I looked at all the PhD programs in Canada. I applied to all of them, and I applied to Harvard. And I only got into Western and Harvard. And this was back in 1990 something. And back then, for reasons we won't get into, I had a green card. And so Harvard said, if you come, you have to sign up for selective services, which is the draft essentially. And the first Gulf War was about to happen, and everybody expected the draft to be a reality. I said, there's no freaking way I'm going to the USA and being drafted into the American military. Looking back, it was a stupid way of thinking because clearly I could have just left if it came to that. But I chose to go to Western instead, and that was some pros and cons to it. I didn't have a great time there, but I finished a high-quality PhD thesis. I didn't love epidemiology when I chose to go into it. I love the idea of epidemiology. I have since learned to love it because I've become a supposed expert in the field. And once you develop expertise in a thing, you discover the poetry of that science. And the beauty of epidemiology is that no one knew what it was. Now everyone knows what it was. Back then, nobody knew. And so if no one knows what a thing is, that could be both an advantage and a disadvantage. It's a disadvantage if you are not creative and unable to capitalize on the moment. If you are, as I think I was, I realized I can make it whatever I want it to be. If no one knows what it is, it's whatever I say it is. And as a result, I catapulted from that to doing work in bioterrorism, in biotechnology, in policy, in anything with a medical or health or biology slant, I claimed expertise in. And with the confidence that I could acquire sufficient expertise to express myself lucidly in that field. And this goes back again to the communications angle. Communication skills at a high level fill in a lot of gaps in expertise that you might otherwise have, because you can extract information from other sources, distill it, and express it in a cogent way that is useful for other people. Very often, we get bogged down in acquiring deep expertise, which is important, but if it's so deep that you cannot share it lucidly with the world, it is not that useful. It is more useful to have the skills of sharing and some degree of expertise than it is to have deep expertise and not the skills of sharing. So I went off on a tangent there. The point being that epidemiology has since emerged as one of the most important fields in medicine at the moment, and possibly one of the great career options in the future. My path into it was based on external factors around the values associated with epidemiology and not the core thinking itself. And I think there's a lesson here that we get too bogged down in thinking about the core subject area of what we're studying and not about what it represents in a larger societal context.
I love that line. That's a great point. I think nobody really thinks that way. You can have people tend to get tunnel vision into whatever they're studying sometimes, especially if that's like a hard science topic and you kind of lose the big picture. So that's a really great point to make.
Thank you. I interrupt for a second. I mean, this is part of the strengths of our program, our interdisciplinary program, is we discourage you, I think we hope we discourage you from getting too centered in one subject area. You're supposed to cross-pollinate in other ways of thinking so that you can solve problems in every context, not just the context of health.
Yeah, and writing our theses in this program almost forces you to, you have to consider the big picture when you're talking about interdisciplinary topics. And yeah, that's been super interesting in the work I've done anyways in this program. So the last question in this section is, how do you describe your leadership style?
Oh man! First of all, I reject the prospect that I am indeed a leader. But if we presume for a second that is the case, I have to take a step back and ask myself, what is leadership? Very often we reduce it to a simplistic vision of management, managing others, getting a product out in an efficient manner. I don't see it that way. Leadership is often the prospect of developing character, being knowledgeable and cognizant of oneself, that can be an example to others, even though it's never my intent to be an example to others. Never. My intent has always been self-development for the purpose of adding meaning to my life. But when you strive for authenticity and depth of character, an amazing thing happens. People gravitate towards that endeavor and tend to take seriously what you say because it is not tinged with deceit and obfuscation. It is seen as the words of truth. So I think my leadership style, if there is one, is to strive for truth in all ways. And I never try to tell people what to do or to suggest that I know best what to do. It's more like, I think, based upon my reading of the situation, here is the path forward, and I'm open to other paths forward. And people seem to resonate with that. It's not the ideal style, but it's a style that works for me.
Authenticity. You can't go wrong with authenticity in whatever you do. It's a great point. Okay, so I'll pass this over to Michelle now for our second section of questions. Thank you for answering those ones. That was great.
My pleasure.
Yes, thank you. That was so interesting to learn about your path, and for sure none of us are on a linear path, which is a great thing, I think. And so my next question is, what leadership skills do you find most useful in your current position? And what skills do you think would be valuable for someone to become a leader?
Okay. Introspection, I think, is key for all things. Knowledge of this, everything begins with knowledge of the self. How can you seek? How can you pretend? How can you deign to advise and direct others if you cannot direct yourself accordingly? If your life is chaos, if you're unsure of who you are and what you're doing, then you're not in a position to advise or direct or manage others. That is my opinion. So it must begin with management of the self. And management of the self begins with introspection. So have you taken a deep dive into your history, your frailties, what you genuinely care about? And part of that is knowing the limits of your expertise. I suffer from profound, crippling imposter syndrome, as every academic does, as everybody on this call does. And we're all embarrassed by it. Don't be embarrassed by it. Thrive in it. Rejoice in it, because imposter syndrome says you are humble and that you're open to being enlightened by additional information. And the moment that I lose my imposter syndrome is when I start to panic. When I start feeling confident, I start to panic. When I'm about to go on stage and give a talk or something, if I'm not nervous, I start to panic. Why am I not nervous? It's got to come back, because if the nervousness keeps you on edge. So I'm off on a tangent there, but the skills, I think, is reminding yourself to be humble and to be, again, nervous and introspective. Defining who you are is important. Defining what leadership is important. Defining what the task at hand is important. I used to do a lot of wedding emceeing gigs, believe it or not. People ask me all the time to huge Indian weddings, which are huge productions, if you don't know. These are almost game shows. And the best advice someone gave for me before that I did the first one was, nobody's there to see you. Nobody wants to hear your anecdotes or hear your jokes or whatever. They just want you to keep the machine rolling. That is a brilliant piece of advice. And that's how I approach these kind of management roles, is just keep the machine rolling. It doesn't have to be about me. No one cares about me. I'm just sitting in a chair right now with a job to do. So keep the machine rolling. So to answer your question in a roundabout way, it comes down to introspection, humility, and keeping the machine rolling.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. I think we all deal with imposter syndrome, especially at this level. Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up.
It never goes away.
This leads me to my next question, I guess, as imposter syndrome being a challenge. But what is the most challenging issue you've had to deal with as a leader in your organization, and how do you overcome it?
Again, it's probably imposter syndrome. It infects everything that we do. It's also being okay with being disliked, to be honest. Once you're in a position of making decisions, no matter what you decide, someone's going to be unhappy. I've been in a number of court cases as an expert witness and so forth. And one of the best pieces of advice that I heard a judge offer witnesses was, if that judge is arbitrating an agreement, they feel they've succeeded if everybody is unhappy. If someone's happy, it means someone else is profoundly unhappy, right? So if you're a decision maker, if you are managing conflict, then contentment is not the same thing as happiness on the parties that are being managed here. So being okay with people being discontent with what you've done is key to all this. So managing departments and universities is interesting, because students come to you with issues that they think are life and death, but they almost always are not life and death. They're always like, I need to drop this course, my GPA is going to struggle. That's not going to affect your life in any way, shape, or form. Okay. But you make a decision and they are stultified by your inability or unwillingness to accept the fact that their needs are paramount in the universe. You got to be okay with the fact that student went home and probably cursed you out to their roommate. And this sounds like a small thing, but most of us want to be liked. I want to be liked. And when someone dislikes you because of something you've deliberately done, it hurts. But you got to be okay with that. So that's one thing. You got to be okay with being disliked. You have to manage the imposter syndrome. a great deal, because every time I've been in a situation to make decisions, I've always wondered, why? How am I qualified to do this? Then you realize no one's qualified to do it. Like when I started commenting in public about the pandemic, the first couple times I went on national TV, I was wondering, how on earth are they asking me? Surely there are better experts. And yeah, there are totally better experts. And I've since met many of them, and they're all as terrified as I am. At the global level, they're all as terrified as I am. And no one thinks they're an expert, even the tippy top best experts in the world, unless they're a psychopath. And by the way, they do exist in academia, right? So once you realize that everyone feels the same way, it gets a little easier. Again, a roundabout way to answer a fairly straightforward question.
I love these answers. So actually, this is a great segue into our next section, which is leadership during a pandemic. So this is a fun question because you're at the forefront of things, and I see you on the news almost daily, which is great. Can you comment on how the pandemic has affected your work?
Yeah, it's affected everything. Affected everyone's work, obviously. And for me, it's catapulted me into unearned fame. And I say unearned deliberately because I didn't do anything special. I just talk about things in the air. But people perceive me as an expert in COVID research, which I'm not. What I am an expert in, I think now, if I can find, I feel comfortable now saying I'm an expert at something. I'm an expert at talking about it. And it struck me that this was surprising that few people had that expertise. And it has become a very important bit of expertise. So I go back to the communications angle again. I'm not a COVID researcher. I'm a mediocre epidemiologist. I'm the first person to admit this. But I think I'm an extraordinary speaker and writer. And when that is married to okay research skills, suddenly something remarkable can happen. So how has it affected my work? It has really crystallized the fact that my role in all of this is in communication, not necessarily in devising, discovering new data and analyzing new data. Right? It's given me some power, strangely, because it turns out that this level of fame suits the university in a good stead, and therefore I can, I have greater access to power than I have in the past. It's also caused me, though, to step back a bit because I don't want to bring disrepute to my students, my colleagues, university. So if you followed me on Twitter before, I've told a lot of dick jokes in my life. That's my thing, dick jokes. I used to be a comedy writer. Like I thought I was a comedy guy, not very good at it. And as a professor with tenure, I can do whatever I want. But suddenly I can't do whatever I want. When the nation is watching you, I can't engage in petty fights with trolls on Twitter because that gets amplified and I'm the bad guy. I can't make the joke I wanted to make because suddenly someone doesn't understand that and that makes the university look bad. So when all the eyes are on you, suddenly you have to take a step back and just only distill and express the safest bits of information and restrict the other stuff for your innermost circles. And that can be challenging. That's almost a political perspective. That's what politicians feel. And I don't like it. I don't like it. It compromises the authenticity that I value so much. So the balancing act is to be authentic in what I express, but to be open that I'm not expressing everything that I'm thinking.
That's great. And my last question for this section is, how are you responding in your role as an expert and an academic to the current paradigm shifts occurring with the global pandemic and on racial justice work?
Yeah, that's a good one. Following up on what I just said, I use my platform sparingly. Like I talk about COVID when I can and must. I'm careful that I don't overstate what I don't know. And when someone challenges me, for example, yesterday I tweeted something on, I think this flu season is going to be maybe a bad flu season for a number of reasons. And among them, I said the flu vaccine that we had this year is an educated guess. Usually flu vaccines are based on what was circulating last year. Nothing circulated last year, so we have nothing to base it on. Therefore, there might be a poor match between the current vaccine and the current strain of flu, and as a result, we might have a spike in cases. And someone pointed out, well, then, if there was no flu circulating last year, then the previous year should be the basis of the current flu vaccine. And I said, you know what? I don't know. I'm not a virologist. I don't know. And it took strength to say, I don't know. Even after having tweeted this declarative statement about, I think the flu season is going to be rough for these reasons, to take a step back and say, you know what? these things here I expressed opinions on, I don't really have full expertise on. So it's important to have that humility built into this. Using the platform sparingly is important. So people are always asking me to amplify their message around this thing or that thing or whatever. And I want to, but I've decided I'm only going to talk about a handful of subjects that are important to me. Among them is racial justice. I mean, sexism is important to me. This country invading that country is important to me. Climate change is important to me. All these things are important. But my lived passion is racial justice. And so to the extent that I have a platform, I will touch upon that as well. So it has caused me to have to select what I'm going to be associated with in the public, understanding that no matter what I choose, there's going to be pushback and hate. So, I used to be a lot more political. I have to dial that back again. So a couple of parties have since approached me to run for them, and I don't want to. But they're always contacting me saying, I wouldn't tweet about that if I were you. That compromises our ability to market you in the future. Like, go away. I don't want to talk about that, But it's still in the back of my mind. If in fact a career elsewhere lays in wait for me, and I've got to watch what my public persona is. It is it's disconcerting, but it is what it is, and it's better than having no power whatsoever.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Michelle, this is the last section for you.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think are the qualities for a good mentor or leader? It's a little open-ended.
Wow. No, that's a good question. I've resisted so far talking about philosophy, but I think philosophy makes a big part of this. So I'm ostensibly a Hindu, and I do derive some wisdom from ancient Hindu thought, particularly around a concept called dharma, which is the art of doing what is right. And everyone's dharma is different. And your dharma isn't just doing your job, it's doing your job as a father, as a brother, as a son, as a daughter, as a wife, or whatever. So if everyone just does their job, then the world tends to unfold the way it's supposed to unfold. And sometimes it's difficult to do your job. And dharma expressed in the Western sensibility is seen most commonly in Stoicism, which I'm a big fan of Stoicism, the writings of Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca. And Stoicism tells us, A, do your job. B, don't worry about other people's jobs unless you are responsible for that. C, don't worry about other people think of you. D, I'm up to D. There are a couple of phrases in Stoicism we must meditate upon. The first is memento mori. The second is amor fati. Memento mori means remember you will die. Sounds depressing, but it's inspiring. If you remember you will die, you realize I have a limited amount of time to deal with. And I'm not going to fill that time worrying about things I can't control. I can't control if that troll who is tweeting me hates me. It bugs me, to be honest, but I've learned to block it out because it doesn't matter. I can't control it. I can't control whether or not the housing prices will crash next year. And I just bought a house last week. Don't lose sleep over it. Right? I can't control that. So I have limited time to worry about it. Amor fati means love your fate, or as Nietzsche put it, love your life. So life is going to throw barriers at you, challenges. It's going to fill you with anxiety and discontent and worry. Love it. Learn to love it. Sorry, trying to interrupt my conversation by calling me on the phone. There's a sense that when barriers are thrown at you, you should be upset by that. No, it's an opportunity to develop your resilience and to express and try out the philosophical tools you've been working on. So when, let's say, an exam is, I'll try to give an example here. Let's say you're sick one day and you got to write an exam. Like, oh, I wish I wasn't sick. If only I was well. No, love it. Love the fact that your life got a little bit harder because now you got a problem to solve. And the more problems you solve, the better you are at problem solving. So what are the qualities of a good mentor? Someone who I think teaches and embodies the philosophy of excellence during struggle. And that is amor fati, is knowing to love the struggle and to keep your attitude of a high quality during a struggle. I think about Star Trek: The Next Generation as well. I do. It's a lot of wisdom in the behavior of Captain Picard, and I quote him all the time in a variety of philosophical contexts. One context was when on a planet where Wesley Crusher had tripped over some plants, and now the aliens were going to sentence him to death because it's against the law to trip over plants, and these other aliens were going to prevent Captain Picard from taking Wesley away to save his life. And Captain Picard appealed to the aliens by saying, "There can be no justice so long as laws are absolute." There's an important bit of wisdom there. It talks about rules are not in and of themselves a core value. Rules are an expression of societal desire. So the spirit of the rule must be applied, and not the letter of the rule. Do not be ruled by pedants and lawyers. Be ruled by philosophers and good people. The other thing that Picard taught me was in how the decision-making is done. Decision-making is done by a leader, someone who assesses the opinion of everybody in the room and then makes their own decision. Now, this can piss off a lot of people, saying, "You asked for my advice, I gave you my advice, and you did something entirely different." Yeah, because your advice is advice. Your advice is not direction. The leader makes decisions by taking advice. This is something a lot of people fail to understand. You've probably come across this in your own life when you've asked someone for advice and given you advice, and then you do not follow that advice, and suddenly your relationship is challenged. That's okay. Advice is advice. It's not direction. And if you're a quote unquote leader, I think your job should be to be the dumbest person in the room. That's a hard thing to accept psychologically, especially in academia where we are primed to be the smart guy, smart girl, whatever, in that room. And this is where the humility comes in. To surround yourself with better people and realize that your humble role is, again, to distill opinion and to write down a single sentence of action later on. That's all you care about. The smartest person shouldn't always be the person in charge. The person in charge is the humblest person who can understand and, again, distill a variety of perspectives. Hopefully that's a good answer. I went off on a tangent again.
No, that's great. That's a really great quality to have in a leader. And would you have any other pieces of advice to give to students who are looking to gain leadership experience?
I have so much advice for students. First thing is you've got to develop communication skills. Communication is everything. Communication takes you into every arena of power and takes you out of every challenge you may encounter. Communication is the key to winning debates or at least surviving debates. It's the key to managing conflict in your personal life or in your professional life. And communication is this. It's interpersonal conversations. It's writing. Sometimes it's sitting still and listening. That's communication. So any chance you get to develop communication skills, jump at it. We don't teach you that in our graduate programs because we're a science program. We really should. As this pandemic has taught us anything, communication is the tragedy that we have underplayed and under-resourced. Other things to look at is, there's some, banal things you can do, like, hey, join a local group or start a group or start a company. All that stuff is great. And other people you interview in the series will tell you that, hey, join this group, whatever, the local business community. Okay. But one thing that we rarely tell young people to do is work on yourself. Understand who you are. Self-knowledge is everything. And maybe at the end, well, there is no end, but maybe in the process of developing self-knowledge, you decide you don't want to be a leader. That's okay. The world can't be made up of all leaders. The world needs followers. And by the way, all of us are both leaders and followers at different times during our life and different times during the day. It's amazing to me. I'm called up by some international news organization, and I sit here with my ego all inflated, and they ask my opinion on stuff, and then I turn around and my spouse yells at me for not taking the garbage out. So you get your ego inflated by one place and deflated a second later by somebody else, because that's the complexity that is life. Understand life is complex. Understand your roles in life are going to shift every second. Understand your relationships with different people in your life have different contexts and different hierarchies. Understand that being a leader doesn't mean you're ordering people around. Understand that being led doesn't mean you're being ordered around. It's all, we are in it together to achieve certain outcomes, and we have different roles to play in the process of achieving that outcome. And to best play those roles, we need to understand the self and to expunge the self of these unproductive, not useful elements that include obsessing over things you cannot control, that include feeling anxiety over things that aren't really relevant. If you feel anxiety, as pretty much all young people do these days, I have no advice for you because I don't know how to solve it, except to say that, hey, you know what? Acknowledge it, just push it aside, realize everyone feels it. So I'm off on a tangent again. But my point, my advice for people seeking leadership is just know yourself. Spend some time in meditation. Get off social media and TV and just think about yourself and your life and understand those two stoic calls, memento mori, you will die, and amor fati, love your life. Even when it's miserable, love it because life is a gift and you got always so many opportunities to mess it up. So mess it up well, then fix it later on. That was a messy answer.
Great. Thank you. I don't know if the philosophical aspect of memento mori has anything to do with the book or movie, but
Is it a movie?
have you seen either or read the book or the movie?
I've never heard of either one.
Oh, really? I think you would enjoy it.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that was very interesting. Thank you.
No problem.
And Julia, are we going to open the floor for questions from students now?
Yeah,
or from everybody who's attending?
Sure. There's actually a comment here in the chat box. I don't know if you saw it.
Let me see. Space and arts and music are vital to everything, including leadership. Thinking of your days from high school now, can you think of one song per decade? One song per decade? No, I cannot. I'm sorry. I do love music, but for me, it's more about how music makes me feel, not the lyric necessarily. And it's context dependent. So, for example, one of my favorite books is the Foundation trilogy, Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy. And when I was reading the book back in the early 80s, I had in the background on an 8-track player, because I'm that old, Vangelis's Heaven and Hell, which is an orchestral piece, electronic music. And it still resonates with me now because that piece of music tells the story of what I was reading. It's a triumphant, almost militaristic, but cosmic kind of music. And it's also the theme music from the TV show Cosmos, which was quite informative for my growing mind in the late 70s. So Cosmos, if you don't know, was a miniseries documentary made by Carl Sagan about the nature of science and the history of science. And it's probably why I decided to be a professional scientist, was watching Cosmos, and Carl Sagan was my hero. I ended up meeting him years later, and now there's a new Cosmos series with Neil deGrasse Tyson. But the point is that the music of that show was the same orchestral piece, Vangelis's Heaven and Hell. So it was inspiring. It was thought-provoking. There's no lyrics attached to it, and it had a cosmic feel. So there is eternity built into it. There's wonder built into it. And but to take your question further, yeah, the arts are really important, and we underplay that in the sciences. In interdisciplinary studies, we really need to include more humanities. I've tried to inculcate in this conversation an element of the study of philosophy. We don't do this enough. We have to ask ourselves why we study what we study. We study it because of thousands of years of philosophical foundation building that tells us one path to truth is through scientific investigation. Another path to truth is through literature and art. Another path to truth is through divinity and religion and self-contemplation. And ultimately, I believe they all take us to the same endpoint at the end of our lives. But it behooves us to understand that there is truth and beauty to be found in each of these paths. And I encourage every student to dip their feet into these other modes of being and of thinking, because it makes you a more complex and interesting person. Lay it on me. More questions. I can keep on talking.
Yeah. If anyone has anything, you can just unmute yourself and ask the question if you want.
I have a question that goes along with. Oh, I'm so sorry. I just saw a hand. I have my screen. I'll give the platform to someone else. I can't see the name associated with the hand.
Schwab.
Julia, do you see?
Yeah.
Schwab.
Go ahead, Schwab.
Dr. Ray, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Well, before that, I enjoy watching you with Ben Mulrooney. It looked like you guys were friends for a long time. That was really great. uh, you're so busy. You have some tremendous responsibilities with the University of Ottawa, and I understand also with the University of Toronto in some capacity. How do you balance all that with family life?
Yeah, it's a good question. It is hard. It's challenging, and something's got to give. What gives is A, sleep, B, the things that I do for personal entertainment. I haven't read a book in so long. And I have this book I'm wanting to read so badly, like I have no time. I haven't written a paper or done research in a very long time. Something's got to give. So it's important to prioritize what's important right now. Family's always number one. Taking care of my kid is number one. My dog and my wife. My dog's number two. Wife, whatever. um, then then the pandemic is up there too, because the pandemic is time limited. It's only going to last for so long, and people, I think, need me now. I can catch up later on with the research areas. We have to make time for the things that are important and for self-care. For me, self-care is the things that I mentioned, the meditation, the introspection, sleep, exercise. Again, going back to Stoicism, the Stoics, Marcus Aurelius said that you begin your day doing certain important things. You begin your day with exercise, as I do. You begin your day with thinking deeply, as I do. You make before you manage, meaning that you do your creative thing first. Then you manage your email and stuff later. You prioritize making. You don't prioritize management. Right? So when you do these things, the things on the side fall away. Got to prioritize. But ultimately, self-care comes first. Good question. I have no solid answer except what I offered.
Thank you so much.
No problem. See, Depeche has a question as well.
Hi, I enjoy listening to you. You're a prolific speaker. I have a question taking from your point about as being as a leader within a position of academia where you're dealing with students' issues. What would your principles of fairness be at point of time where you have to be fair? And I know you are in terms of applying what philosophically your groundings towards fairness are. I wanted to see how you practice it, whether if it's proportionality towards, because as you mentioned, somebody is not going to like what you did. So how do you see yourself? What guides you to fairness?
That's a really good question. Oh my goodness. I try to be fair. I don't always succeed. We're all biased, right? And I end of the day, I got to say, I bias towards what's easiest for me. What gets me to the end of the day. Let's be honest here. But fairness when dealing with students versus the administration, for example, I tend to side with the student more so. I begin by biasing myself from the student's perspective because the administration is this giant corporation and who cares about corporations. But at the same time, I protect professors as individuals because I understand the stresses they're under. So to establish fairness when it comes to this particular context, you go to the written policy of what everyone has said that they agree to already. So as a student, you've agreed to this, this, and this. As a professor, you've agreed to this, this, and this. As a university, they've agreed to this, this, and this. Has anyone overstepped what they stated? If you've overstepped what you've agreed to, now your position has been compromised. If you have maintained your role within those confines of what you've agreed to, I will defend you to the death. So it comes down to that. And it isn't always useful that way because sometimes people's experiences are beyond what was imagined in policy. Very often what was imagined in policy did not consider pandemics, didn't consider someone's personal life degrading. Right? So my larger value is I value the individual more than the organization. So it's someone's life we're dealing with versus someone's job. So that's how I manage it on a day-to-day basis. I don't know that I always succeed. That's how I approach it. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Lay it on me. The more I talk, the less I got to change diapers. So Michelle's got a question, I think. No? Okay. I think someone's hands up.
Michelle, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. So sorry about that. It's always tricky with that. I was wondering if you could share any experiences of being and rising as a leader who is a person of color in Canada.
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Oh my goodness.
Or if you have advice for students who identify as being someone of color or being part of a marginalized group.
Yeah. Okay. So when I was a student waiting to start my PhD, I did a year as a receptionist at a government office. That's my important jobs that year to pay off some debts. And when I was there, one of the workers in the office was an economist. He was a Bangladeshi man. Great background he had. Who's fought in the Bangladeshi Civil War and everything. Decided he was going to mentor me. Unannounced. And he gave me a really good piece of advice. He says, 3 pieces of advice, really. One is the best response to racism is excellence. 2 is don't expect fair treatment because the world is full of isms, racism, sexism, homophobia, ism, whatever. And the 3rd piece of advice I can't remember right now. But the first one I want to focus on is excellence. You're going to come across unfair treatment. As a result, unfortunately, we have to be better than the mainstream. And we got to be better in many ways. We got to be better in terms of the excellence of the thing you're being measured against, better in terms of your maturity and the fact you can't clap back and fight back as voraciously as you might. You got to be more strategically, and you got to expect that some people will never understand. So being in the public eye in the pandemic, one day I'm going to publish the emails I get, I think. I get a lot of racist emails, a lot. Now, I went through hell in the 70s, and growing up in Toronto and New York in the 70s, the racism was palpable. Every single day of my life, there's an attack or verbal abuse as a child of color, and that went away in the 90s, and I thought society got better. But having been through it in the 70s, I got a thick skin. Right? I've been called the worst names in the world. I got a thick skin, as many people on this call have as well. So now when some idiot in Alberta sends me a nasty email, I kind of laugh at it. Like, you think you're being clever by calling me these names? You think you're new at this? But at the same time, it reminds me that there are people he is also attacking for whom the skin is not that thick and who are vulnerable. So unfortunately, the pandemic has revealed a depth of intolerance that we thought was not quite as inculcated in Canadian society, but it is. Remind ourselves that they are not the majority. They are a hyper-vocal, tiny minority. Most people are good. Most people are on board with the idea of diversity and inclusion. But for those of us, whether it's women, whether it's a person of color, whether it's another kind of minority, we can't internalize these attacks. Sure. Sorry, my baby's going to make an appearance. He's the car's being moved, and so he's going to be here. It's like, here you go, here, buddy. Oh, here he is. Oh, here you go, buddy. Yeah, look, say hi to the grad students. And this is a half brown guy, so he's going to be a little bit affected by this, and maybe not. And I'm going to watch it really carefully to see whether he can appreciate the fact that his father was a target of some kind of racial abuse, right? Because he's got white skin. We'll find out. So it's important to maintain excellence and note that, okay, so during the abuse that I take from the pandemic, occasionally my veneer has cracked and occasionally I fought back with trolls. And those couple times that it has happened, guess what happened? Those moments when I have been the aggressor have been amplified by the other side to present me as being the asshole in the exchange, right? So that's why we cannot be weak for a moment. It's unfair. It's unfair. This is where we are right now. So the advice I give to students of color, I coughed out something strange there, is to remember that you are the future. The world is becoming more diverse. The world will leave the rest of them behind. And you're on the side of right. And there's an incredible amount of strength to be had in being right. Oh, handing him back. Say bye, fella. He dropped his. I got it. Okay. Right. So as I mentioned, I'm an expert witness now in a number of court cases. And these court cases are one company suing another company. And I represent one company to dissect the epidemiology and the pandemic response, right? And I feel my imposter syndrome coming out. Like, oh my goodness, am I right or wrong here? And their other experts are so mean and aggressive. And my lawyers remind me, he says, look, Ray, you're on the side of right. Yeah, that's right. When you're on the side of right, you can do wonderful things. Righteousness breeds courage. It breeds strength. So the inclusion of people and the defense of people who are being attacked and excluded based solely on their demographics is a righteous passion. And it's never wrong to be right, and it's always empowering to be right. I hope that makes sense. I mean, there is no obvious way to navigate this weird world of prejudice. But social media exacerbates and amplifies the hate. That is not the point, not at all. You have to remember that.
For sure, I think COVID definitely illuminated a lot of the isms in our society, as you mentioned. I think we have another question. I can't see the name for some reason, but
I think it's Yad.
oh
yes,
yeah.
Go ahead.
So first of all, thanks for being super candid. I really enjoyed the discussion and resonated with quite a few things. We're kind of on this path of talking about resilience, right? So my question to you is, on your leadership journey and getting engaged with communities that are resilient. So let's talk about Indigenous communities. What advice would you give to us as graduate students who may embark into research with those communities, and we may not be that familiar with our own spirituality and emotions and the custom itself? So what advice would you give us from that perspective?
Wow. First of all, I'm not sure I'm qualified to give advice in this matter. And it may be overstepping my expertise and authority to give advice in this matter, but I was asked, so I'm going to answer. I was recently interviewed by a high school student, yeah, in Texas about a similar issue, and he's doing a project on how to be allies of diverse people. And he wanted my advice on how to do so. And my first thought is, be a good listener. Right? If we remember not to speak, but to listen first, I think wonderful things can happen. If we remember not to judge, wonderful things can happen. If we remember to respond, if we must respond, with contextualizing our responses in personal experience, not in extrapolating to societal truth. Right? For example, someone can say, I feel discriminated against, and say, well, that's not true because there's no racism in Canada. You don't know. You can just say, I'm sorry to hear that. I personally have not experienced that, and tell me more about your situation. So making it a personal experience thing does not push people away. I think everyone, whether they know it or not, is on a spiritual journey, and by which I do not mean religious. I mean a journey of self-knowledge. Why are we in education to begin with? Why are you choosing this degree? Probably it's because you want to learn more about yourself or develop yourself. That's a spiritual process. You probably have not phrased it that way in your brain, but I think that's what's happening. And when we're dealing with ancient societies for whom this has been well inculcated in their identities, it really lays bare the extent to which we have failed to openly state that that is a core human value, the search for introspection. And it's an opportunity to explore it more fully. So I think my more full answer would be, take the opportunity to ask yourself personal questions. And if you do so openly and with vulnerability, people will resonate with that. Some won't, but most will. I think that's my answer.
That's a great answer.
Thank
We
you.
have one more question from Dr. Phillips, and then I guess we'll wrap up and maybe take a picture if that's okay with you.
Cool.
Yeah, so Dr. Phillips' question is, what if you don't strive for leadership? Can you comment on being a member of a team or the supporting player?
Oh, Karen, I knew she had a question like that. Great question. Yeah. Like, no, not everyone needs to be a leader. I don't want to be a leader. And I think we have to take a step back and ask ourselves, what is a leader? And I've already answered this to some extent. There is leadership in the traditional business sense, like I'm going to order people around, I'm going to organize these people, I'm going to whatever. But I think there's leadership in being an example of a person of high character. So if you're a member of a group being quote unquote led by somebody else, you can still be a person of high character. You can be honest with yourself and others. You can act with honor at all times. You can strive for the greater good of the community or group while at the same time upholding your own personal ethics and rights and needs. So, as I mentioned earlier, we are always simultaneously leaders and being led at different times of the day, let alone our lives. So we have to be able to shift as we go. For example, right now I'm the graduate director. Big deal. What does that mean? I have no idea, right? But I am led by the director of the department, who is in turn led by the dean of the school, of the faculty, who is in turn led by the president of the university. And weirdly, guess what? We're all the same rank. So, so we're actually not led by each other. So it's a weird situation. We've all got tenure. Doesn't really matter what we do. So universities are strange that way. We have these leadership niches, which we are expected to do work and organize others, but really not. And I think the takeaway from this is there is an ultimate goal in every leadership cadre collection environment. And the ultimate goal probably is the production of a product or the achievement of a goal or the enactment of a program. Focus on the goal and focus on treating each other with respect. Doesn't matter who's in charge. Doesn't matter who's making the call. All it matters is you do your job. To bring it back to the very first question, Dharma, do your job. Stoicism, do your job. There is enlightenment. There is centeredness. There is philosophical depth. There is honor in doing your job.
Love this. Love that ending. That's a great takeaway for everyone for this talk, for sure. So I guess if nobody has any more questions, maybe we can, Dina, do you want to take the picture for us?
Sure. Can I ask everyone to please put their cameras on if they can? And I'll take a photo of everybody.
Thank you.
Sweet. Thank you. Okay, cheese.
Paneer.
Or oh, thank you so much. I took a few photos.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for your time today. We know you're really busy, and I think we all got a lot out of this talk, and it's very inspiring. We'll take your messages with us. And thank you again for sharing your experiences so candidly with us too.